Good evening again, everyone, and welcome to Sporty's webinar on personal locator beacons and other survival equipment, what you need to know. We are certainly pleased that you could join us tonight for this webinar. We're going to cover a lot of ground, try to demystify some things, and make you more comfortable with some of the terminology that's out there. A couple of reminders as we get started here. This entire webinar will be recorded, so if you have to step away for a moment, don't worry. This will be available on our website at sportys.com/webinars in a few days. Also, you do have the ability to ask questions, so at any time if you'd like to ask a question, just type that in. We will save some time at the end to answer those, so feel free to throw those questions in as we move along. We are going to take about an hour tonight, and we'll try to finish right on time so we don't take too much of your valuable time. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, who you're listening to tonight, this is me, John Zimmerman. I'm Vice President here at Sportys and a commercial pilot, a multi-engine instrument, and also fly helicopters. So an active pilot, and I've been with Sportys for about 13 years. There's the right slide. So that's me. I'll be your host tonight and walk you through the ins and outs of personal locator beacons and all the other things we talk about in survival. Let's start with a quote that I really like, and maybe it's obvious, but I think it really hits home with the topic at hand tonight. You know, most of us fly around and think that it can't happen to me, it won't happen to me. And the odds are it probably won't. Flying is pretty safe, especially if you take it seriously. But as the Richard Collins quote says there on your screen, pilots don't crash airplanes because they want to. That's why we call them accidents. Kind of funny, but also very true. So just a reminder that bad things can happen. Bad things can happen to good pilots too. You probably remember Steve Fawcett, one of the more interesting characters in aviation. Had thousands of hours, flew around the world solo in a balloon, flew around the world solo in an airplane, very experienced pilot, went out for a local flight in a Citabria one day and never came back. Over $1.5 million spent looking for him, over a year, and it was more than a year until they found Steve Fawcett's airplane. Now, who knows, Steve Fawcett very well may have died on impact, but it just goes to show you he had no PLB on board. And he crashed in the U.S. He wasn't in the water anywhere. And it took over a year to find him, in one of the largest searches for a GA airplane I can ever remember. And by not having a personal locator beacon on board, that made the job of the searchers tremendously more difficult. I think it's a valuable reminder for what a PLB can do for you. Because after all, what's the goal of this? The goal is to get rescued. I have there on the screen, be a wimp, get rescued. It's the truth. You know, nobody needs to try to live out in the wild for 6 weeks while you get rescued. The goal is if the worst does happen, let's get found. Let's get rescued. Let's hope those good guys come and find us as soon as possible. And that's really what we're going to talk about tonight. And that's really what PLB changes the game. Quick overview of what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to talk about what exactly is a PLB, some of the terminology so we demystify it. How does it work? How to pick the right PLB. There are a lot of options out there. We're also going to talk about a couple of other survival products, specifically life vests and life rafts. We're also going to give you a couple survival tips. This is not the U.S. Army Field Manual, but a couple thoughts for you to keep in mind. And then, as I mentioned earlier, leave plenty of time for your questions at the end. Let's start with what is a PLB. And I'm going to start before we even get there. I want to start a quick poll here. Ask you, do you currently own a PLB? If you could just answer on the screen there, simply yes or no. Give just a second for those to come in. And looks like right now, vast majority of people tonight do not own a PLB, and that's to be expected. That's probably why you're on the webinar tonight. So we'll talk a lot about buying PLBs and how to find the right one, since most of you don't own one or are in the market for one. So what is a PLB? Just another acronym we need in aviation. We've certainly got enough of them. It stands for Personal Locator Beacon. And actually, for once, the name is pretty descriptive. the PLB does what it sounds like. It's lightweight and portable. That's the personal part of it. It knows your position. That's the locator part of it. And it transmits a distress signal to search and rescue forces. That's the beacon part of it. Maybe a simplified way to think of it is a portable, personal ELT. Now we'll talk about here a little bit later on why PLBs are very, very different than ELTs. But it's a good way to think about it. This is sort of a portable version of an ELT. Important to note that it's subscription free and it works worldwide. So this is really a set it and forget it type product. But with that in mind, this is a life-saving device. So this is not a way to send an email to your wife and tell her that you're going to be late for dinner because the weather's moving in. This is a way to save your life if you're in a dire emergency. And there's a couple of regulations about that you want to keep in mind. A quick history I think is always interesting to understand where did these things come from. And in this case, there's an interesting history. In 1972, 2 U.S. congressmen crashed in Alaska in a GA airplane that some of you probably remember. I believe to this day, have never found the crash site in Alaska. After this happened, Congress mandated ELTs in airplanes as sort of a knee-jerk reaction. There wasn't really a whole lot of great technology to support it. And as a result of that, there was a push for satellite monitoring because the original 121.5 ELTs weren't worth a whole lot. So with that in mind, something called COSPAS SARSAT came into operation. We'll talk about that more in a minute. This is a satellite-based system created in partnership with the U.S., France, Canada, and the Soviet Union. It was fully activated by 1984 with the sole aim of helping search and rescue forces locate people in trouble. As a result of this SARSAT launch, emergency beacons started to appear that were beyond just ELTs in airplanes. EPIRBs you may have heard of, those became popular on boats, and then ELTs obviously on aircraft. The problem with this is that it didn't do a whole lot to address the safety question. There's a pretty bad record of reliability with these early models. So as a result of that, 406 megahertz beacons were introduced, and we'll explain exactly what that means later. But this is sort of the modern replacement to 121.5 ELTs that were originally mandated. What this enabled was PLBs, the personal small products that we're going to talk about tonight. They were tested in the late 90s in Alaska as sort of a proof of concept and had tremendous results. I believe hundreds of lives saved up there that probably would not have been saved previously. So with that testing in the bag, the FCC, the FAA, everybody involved signed off in 2003, fully authorizing PLBs as really a new category of device. And since they've been introduced just under 10 years ago, they've been tremendously popular with hikers, boaters, skiers, pilots, everybody in between. Has really been a success. And as you see on your screen there, over 28,000 people saved since the start of the original satellite network looking for lost and crashed. Really tremendous stat there. Shows how successful this has been. And PLBs are an integral part of that. Let's talk about some key terms. I think it's always good to have the vocabulary down so as we start throwing around acronyms, we all understand exactly what we're talking about. So we're going to go over not a laundry list, but certainly some of the more popular ones that we're going to need as we discuss PLBs. You see them on your screen there. And let's hope they're not all meaningless jargon by the time we're done. The first one, SAR, this one's pretty easy, search and rescue. You see it a lot when it comes to PLBs in particular. Pretty obvious, these are the good guys, these are who you want to come rescue you. In the U.S., in most cases, you're talking about the Coast Guard, Air Force, or the Civil Air Patrol. It may be other organizations if you're in other parts of the world, but that's a catch-all term for the people that you want to come look for you. We talked about COSPAS SARSAT. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Russian side of it, but let's suffice it to say that COSPAS is the Russian part of it, SARSAT is the U.S.-Canadian part of it. An international satellite system, again, meant to detect downed aircraft and stranded boaters. Over 25 countries participating now, so this really is a global effort, which is really a great thing. And this includes really the whole infrastructure, so the satellites that are listening, mission control centers, the coordination centers. It's really an integrated system that works with ELTs and PLBs, and these are the people who are listening for you. So let's talk quickly about ELT versus EPIRB versus PLB. These are three slightly different versions of the same basic product. ELT is an emergency locator transmitter. These are in every airplane, again, as mandated by Congress. These are made specifically for aircraft. And more to the point, these are permanently installed in the aircraft and paired to an N number. So there's nothing portable about an ELT. This is in the tail of the airplane most of the time, and is usually activated by G-forces automatically. So if you crash, this is going to go off whether you're conscious or not. As I said earlier, these were originally 121.5 megahertz ELTs. These were very inaccurate, and in fact, the vast majority of ELTs in airplanes today are still 121.5. 406 is slowly replacing that on ELTs. But again, an ELT is not a PLB. An ELT stays in the airplane, it's registered to the airplane, there's nothing portable about it. And an ELT may or may not be 406 megahertz. An EPIRB is really for boats, and you can think of this as the PLB version for boating. These came along in the 80s. Oftentimes they're automatically activated if they hit water, and usually somewhat portable, mounted as you can see here in a sort of a quick release box, usually by the door as you're abandoning the ship. Do not buy one of these for aviation. That's not what they're intended for, and it's not going to work for you. PLB, again, we've talked about, but just to be clear, a PLB is a portable version and is really made for anyone. As I said, hikers, skiers, boaters. It's totally portable. It goes with the person, not the vessel. One other important note, PLBs are manually activated. They're not activated by G-forces. They're not activated by water, and that is by law. They can only be activated if you hit the button. So in a sense, that's one drawback. You need to be conscious to push the button, but still very reliable, and the vast majority, they're really taking over. Let's talk quickly about 406 megahertz versus 121.5, because this is the main distinction between ELTs, and really 406 megahertz is what made PLBs possible and is what has made satellite rescue much, much more reliable. They're really just different frequencies, obviously. 121.5, you can see the stats there. Terrible, terrible record of reliability, 97% false alarm rate. So 97% of the time when an ELT signal goes out on 121.5, it is somebody bumped the switch, somebody was inadvertently testing it, it is not a real emergency. And furthermore, they don't even activate in 88% of the crashes, so they're not worth a whole lot, and for that reason, 121.5 is no longer monitored as of February 1st, 2009. That doesn't mean it's worthless. Most airline pilots will monitor 121.5 as they fly, and a lot of GA pilots will as well. But search and rescue forces really are not monitoring that. You can also see how low-powered 121.5 ELTs are versus the 406 megahertz that is what we have in PLBs today. It's really made from the start to be satellite-based. Each individual PLB has a digital ID, so search and rescue forces know who you are. The transmitting power is much more. Furthermore, there's usually a GPS. And one thing interesting to note, most 406 megahertz beacons also include a 121.5 homing beacon. The idea is 406 megahertz is what sends a distress signal, but most search and rescue forces still can home in on a 121.5 beacon. So a lot of new 406 beacons really blend the two together. Final term, GPS. If you're a pilot, you probably know this, but just worth pointing out that this is built into a lot of PLBs, adds very precise position location, and this is the satellite part that's listening for the satellites, not transmitting to the satellites. So how does it work? It's a pretty neat system, and it's pretty reliable. A few steps involved, and I think it's helpful as a PLB owner or even an ELT owner if you understand what's involved in the system. So let's say the worst happens. You're on your way to a great vacation in the Bahamas, and the engine decides to stop cold, and you go down in the water. You make a great landing, and you're out in a life raft. You have your PLB with you. You extend the antenna, push the red button, and it lights up. What happens there is the PLB is going to transmit a distress signal that the satellites are listening for. It's going to include that ID, and it's going to include your GPS location if there's an onboard GPS. So automatically, you are transmitting who you are and where you are. There are two different satellite constellations up there, LEOSAR and GEOSAR. just stands for low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit for better coverage. One mostly over the poles, one mostly over the equator. They're listening to that. They pick up that signal. Even if you don't have GPS, they can use Doppler shift to generalize your position. It's not as accurate as GPS, but it can determine where you are just based on different passes of the satellite. So you've hit the button, you've transmitted it, the satellites hear it. What they then do is transmit that information back to Earth to what are called LUTs, which are basically ground stations, that then forward everything on to a mission control center. In the U.S., that's in Maryland, and this is sort of central control for search and rescue. They will then coordinate with a local rescue center. So if you're in the Bahamas, they may be coordinating with the Bahamian Coast Guard, for example. They're going to get the specifics out to somebody close to you who's actually going to coordinate the rescue. The nice thing is, if you've registered your beacon, as we'll talk about, since it has that ID in there, you have registered some emergency contact information. So the first thing they're going to do is call you and say, is this a test? Make sure it's the real thing, again, to get rid of those false alarms. If you don't answer, they're going to call one of your emergency contacts who may be able to give some really helpful information about where you were going, what you were doing, what you were flying. It's another nice feature that 121.5 ELTs never had. So how well does it work? Quite well, actually. Average notification time, this varies obviously. In the U.S., it's usually as little as 5 minutes from the time you hit that button to the time somebody is working on the problem. Furthermore, PLBs have to hit some pretty good targets in terms of reliability. They must transmit for over 24 hours, and that's at -4 degrees Celsius. So they're pretty reliable. They're powerful, and they're unaffected by weather and terrain. This is a big one, and it works worldwide. So you really can count on your PLB that when you splash down, it doesn't really matter where you are. It doesn't matter if it's raining. It doesn't matter if you're far out to sea. With very, very few exceptions, PLBs will work everywhere. As a result of the accuracy you see over here on the right side, 121.5 ELTs, we were talking 12 to 15 miles of accuracy. That's a huge area. 406 megahertz knocks that down to 2 to 3 miles, which is much, much better. That's still 25 square miles, though, so that's still a lot of area to search for you. You throw the GPS on there, though, and look at how precise you get. You're down to 100 meters. That really changes the game. You've gone from a search and rescue mission to a get and rescue. They know pretty darn well right where you are, and they can find you. Even better, because it's a PLB, it's probably on your body, not on the airplane. So if you're in a raft and you drift away from the airplane, or the airplane goes to the bottom, it's not as big an issue because the PLB is with you. So they're going to come find you, not the aircraft. So the increase in performance and the increase in accuracy has really been a game changer. The combination of 406 megahertz plus GPS is tremendous. So let's talk the buyer's guide. We've talked about how PLBs work. We've talked about the system behind it, and hopefully I've impressed on you the value that they provide and the reliability they have. So if you're in the market for one, let's talk about what you might look for and how you might buy one. Start with a quick note, though. As we said before, PLB is not an ELT, and a lot of you may be aware that 406 megahertz ELTs are being installed in airplanes now. It's getting pretty hard, if not impossible, to install an old-style 121.5 ELT. So just want to be clear that buying a PLB is a great thing, but that does not in any way take care of anything in the airplane. So if you've got an old 121.5 ELT, you're going to have to eventually replace that with a 406 megahertz ELT. That's going to be in addition to your PLB. Now, the old 121.5 ELTs are not illegal. You're still allowed to have them in your airplane. They're just sort of being phased out, and as I mentioned, the frequency is not actively monitored by search and rescue forces. So if you're an aircraft owner and you're considering, do I need to put a 406 megahertz ELT in, that's certainly a personal decision. You don't have to. Now, if something goes wrong with your current ELT, if there's a problem, I certainly wouldn't spend the money to fix your old ELT. I would go ahead and bite the bullet and put a new one in. They're anywhere from about $1,000 to $1,400. But that's a separate decision. Again, a PLB probably has uses that would make it a good buy in addition to an ELT. And again, if you're a renter or in a club, you probably don't have control over that ELT, so a PLB is a great option. A lot of people are using PLBs and saying, I'm going to leave my old ELT in the airplane until it's no longer legal. And that's certainly fine. The only difference is, again, you have to remember to push the button on the PLB. So with that caveat in mind, let's talk about the buyer's guide and finding the right one. I've listed some features on the left side that we're going to talk about, things that are important. Size is important, obviously, the GPS feature. There's an ability to do some messaging through a PLB on some models. Strobe light, does it float? And then how dependable is the PLB? You can have all of those. Obviously, that's got to be weighed against price and to a certain extent ease of use. So that's the balancing act we're going to be playing here. Let's start with size. This has been where the biggest change has been recently. PLBs were never huge, but every year they get a little smaller and a little smaller. The one at the top you see right here is the latest from ACR. It's just about 4 inches tall. It really does fit in your hand. And it's pretty impressive when you think about it because, as I mentioned, these have to transmit for over 24 hours at -4 degrees Celsius. So there's a really big battery in here, and that battery is the main limitation and some of the best technology in here to getting it smaller. With that said, smaller is generally better, although I wouldn't go overboard to buy the smallest possible one. Think about how you're going to use it, where you're going to carry it. It's something to keep in mind. I do think it's important to note that if the PLB is on you or very close to you, you have a much better chance of taking it with you when you exit the airplane after an accident. And that's worth remembering for sure. Also, along those lines, you might consider if it comes with a lanyard or clips, or is there a belt clip. Again, if you're going out on that Bahamas flight, it might be a good idea to go ahead and put that PLB around your neck so you don't have to think. Other than size, there's GPS. This was not a common feature when PLBs first came out. This was actually pretty rare and an upgrade. Fortunately, almost all PLBs now have GPSs. I think the manufacturers realized very quickly that a PLB without GPS is not nearly as useful. So I would call this a must-have feature. I would not buy a PLB if it did not have a built-in GPS. It's just absolutely essential. Again, all the 140 cells have GPSs, and in fact, most of them out there have it. You will see every once in a while one that says PLB Plus. And what that allows you to do is plug in your PLB to a portable GPS. Certainly better than nothing, but I think that's just a step you want to avoid. If you've been lucky enough to make it out of the aircraft after an accident, the last thing you want to have to be messing with is wires trying to plug a PLB into your GPS. So I would absolutely go for a PLB that has an onboard built-in GPS. And there's nothing to do here. When you turn on your PLB in an emergency, it just works. With the ACR model, for example, red flashing light means you're transmitting. That green flashing light means you're transmitting GPS. Usually it will take a minute or two to download the GPS coordinates and start transmitting them. But a really, really important feature. I think it's essential to look for that. And you can see right here where the antenna is on many of these units. It tells you so that you can keep that area clear and not block it. Because like any GPS, it needs a view of the sky to see the satellites. One of the newer features that's out there is called I'm OK messaging. This is not the core of what a PLB does, but it's pretty interesting. Specifically, the ACR units allow you to do a self-test, but this is actually a full self-test through the satellite system. So it's not just a button that checks the battery. This sends a test message all the way through the satellite system, all the way back down to Earth, and you get a return code that says it was successful. That's testing your GPS, that's testing your transmitter, that's testing the battery. A really good peace of mind. But one of the things they can do with this is allow you to send text messages or emails to contact list when you do that. So you're really testing the PLB, but on a limited basis it could be useful if you're at some backwoods fishing hole in the north of Canada and you want to let your loved ones know that you've made it. You can do one of these self-tests or hit the I'm OK button, and that'll send a predetermined message to a predetermined list. So this isn't like your cell phone. You can't get on there and type up a custom text message. But if you set it up ahead of time, you can send a message to friends and family. Really helpful for places that are way out of cell phone range. One note, it does require a monthly subscription for this, or an annual subscription. You can see at $39.95 you get to do one contact, and that does not include the GPS coordinates. For $60 a year, you can send up to 5 contacts with the GPS coordinates. Important note though, that subscription is just for the I'm OK messaging. The basic PLB function, hit the red button, help is on the way, that is always subscription free. That has nothing to do with this. It's a purely optional feature. Quick diagram here on I'm OK just so you can see how it works. Pretty self-explanatory, but make sure you have a clear view of the sky. You're going to hit the test. It's going to go 22,000 miles each way through the satellites. Runs through a website called 406 link that we'll show you later on that processes the message and sends it through the internet. As you can see, text messages or emails that confirm it. And with the Plus service, again, you can do up to 5 people. Certainly not a must-have feature, but a pretty nice feature and one to keep in mind as you're shopping the market for PLBs. How about floating? Strobe light. Another new feature that I think 18 months ago didn't exist on any units and is now on almost all of them, and in fact on all of the ones that Sporty sells. Just another nice to have kind of insurance policy. There's a bright flashing strobe. Most of the time it flashes SOS. And this is the final 100 meters. So if 406 megahertz gets the SAR forces in the ballpark, and then that GPS gets them really close, for that final little bit, the guy in the helicopter looking for you in a tiny life raft, a strobe light can be a surprisingly helpful thing, especially at night. And so again, nice to have because it saves you from carrying a separate strobe light. It's just one less thing to forget as you leave the aircraft. Again, automatically activates, so it's pretty much dummy proof. And all the models we carry from ACR and McMurdo do have this feature. Nice to have, certainly insurance. You can see right here at the top, it's going to flash. Next feature is floating. Another, not a must-have, but this really depends on where you fly, what type of flying you do. Almost all PLBs, and in fact everyone again that Sporty sells, is waterproof. So you don't need to be concerned if it's raining, but that doesn't necessarily mean they float. So if you crash in the desert of Nevada, you're protected from rain, but you probably don't care if it floats. Now if you're like this guy and you're on you're flying a seaplane, or again if you're going to the Bahamas, or even crossing the North Atlantic, a floating PLB may be a really nice feature to have, because the worst thing in the world is to have a perfect PLB that's at the bottom of the ocean while your raft floats away. So I would say if you do overwater flying, a floating PLB is a must-have. The only real penalty is a slightly larger size. Usually there's no extra charge for it. It's the same price. You're just giving up a little bit more size so that it's buoyant. All the ACR models are available in a floating and a non-floating model. Look for the blue version in general. If it's got a little blue wrap on it, that means it's floating. And again, if you're flying over open water, I think that's something you've got to have. Last feature to talk about here is reliability and support. This is sort of tough to put a finger on, but obviously a PLB is a life-saving device. It's got to work the first time. It's got to work every time. There's probably not a product in your airplane short of the engine that has to be this reliable. So I would be very, very picky about what you buy. Sporty sells ACR and McMurdo, the 2 largest brands in PLBs, and they really make quality products, and I would insist on whoever you buy it from, get a quality PLB. An example would be the ACR PLB. While the minimum is 24 hours of transmit time, most of these do 30, 35, even 40 hours of transmit time, so they go well beyond the minimums. They have very durable cases that can take quite a shock. It needs to survive the crash. It needs to survive cold weather. You can see we froze this ACR PLB in a block of ice just to test it and make sure it would still work. Along those lines, what's the life cycle of this unit and what's the warranty on it? What's the company standing behind it? Can you get repairs? These are all great questions to ask anytime you buy anything in aviation, but also a PLB. I would not get caught up in Discount Louie's deal of the day. on a PLB. This is something you want to buy right. Fortunately, prices are coming down to the point where you really don't have to overpay, quote unquote, to get a quality PLB. So now that we know what to look for, now that we know the features that are out there, let's talk about the market very quickly. What are the options specifically for buying a PLB? Help you find one. There is no right answer. Obviously, the right PLB is going to vary depending on who you are, what kind of flying you do, where you fly. But let's go through the most popular models. Starting off with the ACR Rescue Link and the Rescue Link Plus. These are the latest and greatest from ACR. The smallest, I guess tied for smallest PLB on the market. A really compact unit that literally does fit in the palm of your hand. It includes that I'm OK messaging we talked about. It includes a 66-channel GPS built in. It's got a really tough polycarbonate case that can take quite a beating, which I think is important. The Rescue Link model weighs under 5 ounces, which is pretty incredible for what it packs in there. The Rescue Link Plus model is the floating model, and you can see that up here. That's a little bit bigger, as I said, and it's 5.4 ounces, so a little bit of a weight penalty, but not much. Each of these is under 4 inches tall, and they're around $300. Right now they're just under $300, so tremendous value versus where we were a couple years ago with $500–600 PLBs that were twice the size and maybe didn't have a GPS. Here you've got a unit that fits in the palm of your hand, has a built-in GPS and strobe, and is under $300. A tremendous improvement in safety. The big brother to the Rescue Link from ACR is the SAR Link and the Aqua Link. Again, Aqua Link just meaning the floating version. These are the classic style PLBs. They've been on the market a little longer. They also include the strobe light. They also include the I'm OK messaging. They're 6 inches high, so they're a little larger and 8.9 ounces. Although I think you'd have to agree that both of those are, neither one of those is a limiting factor. Those are both fairly small and pretty lightweight. You could certainly wear that around your neck. You could certainly clip that to your belt. They're about $380. Some people like, there's a bigger button on it, a bigger antenna, and it sits a little bigger in your hand. So if you wanted a beefier unit, it's certainly something to consider. The final in the ACR line is the SAR-Link View and the Aqua-Link View. Again, the Aqua-Link meaning it floats. These have a digital display. You can see it right here. That's a neat feature. So this is really a standalone, can tell you a lot of information. It'll show you the GPS lat longs. So, for example, you're in the boat and you thought to bring along your VHF radio. And if you're talking to the search and rescue forces, you can read your lat longs right off the PLB. It also gives you some good status information about battery power and transmission burst. It'll give you some operating tips. So it's a little more of an interactive product. I'd call it the top of the line from ACR. It's also got this reflective front that should help radar from the Coast Guard, for example, pick you up. Includes the I'm OK messaging, includes the strobe light, really all the features you could want. And this one, as the top of the line, is the most expensive at about $480, although, again, a great value compared to what PLBs used to be. It's not all ACR. We do also sell a product from McMurdo called the Fast Find. This is the least expensive one out there. It's the smallest one. It's as tall as the Rescue Link, but a little bit thinner. So if you're looking for the smallest and least expensive, this is the one. It's a little different setup. It's got an antenna that's wrapped around the top that you sort of tear off and open up. All PLBs are really one-time use. If you ever use it for real, it needs to be sent back and recertified because of the battery. But the ACR antennas sort of flip up. They're a hard antenna. You can flip up and down, whereas this one you can't. It does include GPS. It does include a strobe light. It does not include the I'm OK messaging feature. So I would call this more of a basic PLB. Again, if you want the small, inexpensive one, it's got all the features you want, but not some of the higher-end features like a screen or the I'm OK messaging. So that's the market for PLBs. But there's probably some of you out there right now thinking, well, what about some of these other products I've heard about? For example, the Spot or the InReach. And we'll talk about those briefly. One thing I think it's important to point out is that these are not PLBs. These are usually called satellite messengers, and that's a good description of what they are. They operate quite differently from PLBs, and they're intended for a different mission, I think. The good part of these are they're generally less expensive. So the Spot is $150. The InReach from DeLorme is $250 ballpark. But they're a little different setup. For example, they use different satellite constellations. So the Spot uses Globalstar, InReach uses Iridium. These are commercial satellite networks. They're used for satellite phones and things like that. That's not to say they're bad. They're just not quite as reliable. The coverage isn't quite as good as the SARSAT network. It's just a little different setup. And again, as I said, they're more for communication, so they have a lot more features along those lines. You can check in frequently. You can send text messages. You can see on the Spot here, this is a map that you can mark your path as you go, which is a great feature. So there's a lot more interactivity to it. But along those lines, it's not quite as reliable as a life-saving device. For example, it's lower powered. It's not going to work if you're under a dense canopy of trees or you're in a canyon. It uses a different response center. It's not going to go to that command center in Maryland. It uses the GEOS response center, which is a private emergency response center. And it does require an annual subscription. So whereas a PLB only requires an annual subscription if you're going to use some of the messaging features, the Spot and the InReach require an annual subscription for everything. They're usually about $100 to $150 a year. The DeLorme InReach can get a little bit higher for some fancier features, but plan to spend at least $100 to $150 a year on these to enable any of these features. One of the neat things they've both recently come out with, though, is that they do interface with iPhone and Android. So you can have a Spot or an InReach connected to your iPhone and actually send custom text messages from 10,000 feet. And your friends can get on a website and track you as you fly. So again, there's great features there. I would just call that a communicator. It's not a life-saving device. If you're looking for something that your friends can keep track of you as you fly to Oshkosh, or you want to sort of check in on a hiking trip, these are great devices. But I would not count on this as a life-saving device, and again, they have the subscription. There's another product out there that you may have heard of that's along those lines, slightly different. It's called Spider Tracks. Also not a PLB. It's a little bit closer to a PLB than the Spot. They call it an active tracking system. What happens here is you've got a little box that you see here sitting on a glare shield. You plug it into the cigarette lighter and you go flying. And the active tracking part means this device checks in via satellite regularly. And if the monitoring service does not get a check-in after you started a flight, it's going to automatically assume something went wrong. So that's why I've got guilty until proven innocent. This product is not going to wait for you to push a button. If you miss a check-in, they are automatically going to send for help. Now there is a red button there, so if you do want to manually activate the SOS mode, you can. But again, it's as they say, this is the emergency device that doesn't have to survive the crash because it's automatic. There's also some neat flight tracking features alongside this. You have a very powerful website where people can log in and watch you fly. A lot of the tour helicopters in Las Vegas use this so that the company can track all of their different helicopters as they're out on tours. But again, it uses the Iridium satellite constellation, and there's no battery, so if you go down and the aircraft is out of action, there's really no way to use this. So more of a life-saving device than a Spot or an InReach, but a little different situation. It's also a lot more expensive to see. It's about $1,000 ballpark, and there is a monthly or an annual tracking fee for this. So usually used by corporate operators more and not as much individual pilots. A couple of tips I wanted to share with you on PLBs, and as an owner of one, what do you need to be aware of? First and foremost, if you get nothing else out of this, you must register your beacon. If you buy a PLB, you must register it. It's actually required by law. In addition to that, it's an incredibly good idea. There's a quick website I'll show you at the end here. You go online, register your beacon. You update that every 2 years. Again, this way, rescue forces know who the beacon's registered to. They'll even associate a tail number with it if you regularly fly the same aircraft. You can put your emergency contact information in. It's just a way to keep track of PLBs and it's absolutely essential. The first thing you should do when you get a PLB is register it. It's free. Second is battery care. Again, the battery technology here is a big deal, and that's a big part of what makes PLBs work. It's a sealed lithium battery usually. It lasts, it has a shelf life of 10 years, but I wouldn't get caught up in that. The important part is that it must be replaced or inspected 5 years after placed into service. So go ahead and plan on every 5 years sending this back, either to the manufacturer or to a service center. There's some local ones that'll do that. Rates vary. It can be $50, it can be $100, but again, it's really worthwhile on a unit that's going to potentially save your life. Just a couple reminders on actually using it. GPS needs a clear view of the sky, and the PLB antenna should be vertical. So you see this guy here floating. This is a great spot for a PLB. If you can, get it up out of the water, get the GPS pointing up with a clear view and the antenna fully extended and pointing up. One point on buying a PLB, I'm obviously biased and would love to have you buy it from Sporty's, but I also think it's important wherever you buy it from a real shop. If you buy a PLB from somebody that doesn't sell many a year, he could have a PLB on the shelf that already has a 3-year-old battery. So you're already going to be starting with an older battery. You want to buy one that's got a fresh battery from a supplier that really sells a lot. And then the last thing, self-test is a good idea. I wouldn't be paranoid about it, but certainly if I was going on a long trip and you knew this was going to be a critical performance time, do a self-test. On the ACR units, it's really, really easy. You get 420 self-tests over the 5-year battery life without affecting that. You can do the GPS self-test where it actually connects, gets the GPS information and sends the lat-long information. You can do that 12 times with the SAR-Link or 60 times with the SAR-Link view. So that would be going all the way for a test, but at the very least do a test to make sure the battery's good and it's transmitting. It's not all about PLBs, so I want to touch briefly on some other survival equipment that you ought to consider as a part of PLBs. First is life vests. This one you might need more than you think you do. FAR 91509 says if you're more than 50 nautical miles from shore, you need life vests for everyone on board. So that's not just a trip to the Bahamas. If you're going over Lake Michigan on your way to Oshkosh, you ought to have a life jacket on, a life vest on board. It's required. The good thing is they're small, they're lightweight, they're relatively affordable. It's really cheap insurance. It's just there's no excuse not to have a life vest on board for everybody if you think you're going to at all need it. The other tip I'd say is do not mess around with boating vests. If they're water activated, that's actually worse than no life vest, because if you crash in the water and that life vest goes off, you're going to be inflated inside the airplane and you're going to really struggle to get out. You do not want a water activated life vest. Also, I would not mess around with a water skiing vest or the boating vest that are the foam. Those are just far too bulky. So get an aviation vest. Which one to buy? You've got some options. A TSO'd versus a non-TSO'd vest. TSO'd really isn't required for anybody, Part 91 especially, but in general TSO's indicates a high quality of manufacture. Dual cell versus single cell. Dual cell, again, you have some redundancy. That's the type that is on the airlines, not required. Single cell is less expensive. 10-year versus a 5-year shelf life. Again, these things need to be recertified, repacked every once in a while. If it's vacuum packed, that gives you 10 years versus 5 years. There's very little price difference in that, so I would recommend that if you can. And then the only other option, not really good or bad, but you can store it in a bag where you tear open the bag and put it on, or there's the constant wear vest type where it's uninflated but you wear it around your neck, and so if you do go down, you're already wearing the life vest. That's a good idea if, say, you fly helicopters over the Gulf of Mexico or you regularly fly low over the water. That's a good idea because it's right there with you. For more casual use, I'd suggest the ones that store in a bag. As far as quality, again, I would not skimp. Sporty sells Switlick life vests. These are all TSO'd. They all are vacuum packed, so they have a 10-year shelf life. They're all made in the USA. Switlick, we think, is the premier maker of life vests. They really make a quality product. Along with life vests, obviously a complement would be life rafts. Again, if you're going over Lake Michigan to Oshkosh, maybe you don't need this. Certainly if you're going to go fly the islands, you want a life raft. And this is one not to skimp on, because it's tempting to save some money on a life raft, but if you ever need one of these, you really need it. And so there's three basic styles here. You see a basic raft, a raft with a canopy, and then a dual tube TSO raft. You can see the features there for each one. The basic raft really is just a raft. It's got a boarding ladder on it, but that's about it. So it'll keep you out of the water, it'll keep you dry, but really no survival pack in it. There's no ballast for a smoother ride through rough waves. There's no canopy. The raft with a canopy is really, I think, the best option for most people. That canopy is essential. It also includes the ballast system, which you see right here. That just lets the raft rock a little less, better chance of not getting seasick. That's the last thing you really want to do if you've made it into a life raft. And they also usually include a flashlight, signal mirror, and a knife. And they're starting about $3,500 versus $2,000 for the basic raft. The TSO raft is really only if you're flying Part 121 or 135. They're great rafts, but you can see they're more expensive. And they have the dual inflation tubes for redundancy, but probably more than most piston GA pilots need. Certainly if you're flying Part 121 or 135, you're going to need this. So again, buying tips on a life raft, get that canopy. I really think it's absolutely worth it. Specifically, get a self-erecting canopy. There are some guys out there that sell rafts with a canopy that you have to put together with poles, sort of like an old-fashioned tent. To me, the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in a raft trying to put up a tent. With a Winslow life raft like Sporty sells, you pull the cord and it all happens. It's a self-erecting, inflating canopy. And I think that canopy is really worth it. If nothing else, it keeps the sun off of you. And that exposure can be a real problem if you're out in the water for a long period of time. Think about your load. These are all rated usually 4, 6, or 8-man life rafts. 4 adults in a 4-man raft is really tight. It's legal, but it's tight. If you've got 4 big brawny people or 5, you definitely want to spend a couple extra $100 and get a 6-man life raft. Rafts are not all for water. I certainly wouldn't buy one just for this, but if you have a raft already and you're going to fly across the desert Southwest, take it along, because a raft with a canopy, again, to keep you out of the sun, can be a very, very useful thing. Winslow replace rafts free if you ever use it for free, so you've got a bit of an insurance policy there. Quick tip on using it: tie the raft to a seat in the aircraft and then throw it out the door as you inflate it. If you throw it out the door and inflate it and don't have it anchored to the aircraft, it very well might float away and be useless. All those cords will break, usually under about 50 pounds of force, so if the airplane starts to go down, it will snap that cord. Again, Sporty sells Winslow. Like Switlick, we think they are absolutely the finest rafts out there. They're made in the USA. They've been the top pick by Aviation Consumer for years. They just make the best stuff. They have the features you want. Real quickly wrapping up, I want to just give you a couple other ideas for a few other survival tools. I think PLB is #1 most important by far. I think if you fly over water, life vests and rafts are second. Just some other ideas to keep in mind. The old rescue mirror with a whistle, as you see here, is cheap and surprisingly effective. And so not a bad insurance policy to have that. There are also standalone strobe lights. Also might consider medical kits. A good knife will go a long way in a survival carbon monoxide detector and pulse oximeter and oxygen system. Not necessarily survival, but certainly things that could be survival products at some point. Things to consider, again, depending on the type of flying you do. Certainly a rescue mirror, a basic medical kit, and a knife. Inexpensive, small, probably ought to be on your airplane every time you leave the pattern. Almost no excuse not to. I want to give you a couple of quick editorial comments as we wrap up, and then get some questions from you. Totally biased personal opinions, but I think it helps to at least give a flavor of my opinion. A PLB, as I think I've made clear, I really think is a must-have tool. If you're flying cross-country, especially over hostile terrain or water, you absolutely owe it to yourself and your passengers to have one. That old 121.5 ELT in the back is about worthless. I hate to say that, but it's really the truth. You saw the stat. It's 88% of the time not going to activate. PLB for $300 or $400 is cheap insurance. Any of the PLBs we sell are good. I would recommend all of them without hesitation. If you ask me for the best, I would say the ACR and specifically the Rescue Link is the best bang for the buck. Again, made in the USA, great quality in that that Rescue Link is small and yet it packs all the features in there. So if you had to pin me down on one, that's probably it. The spot or the inReach versus PLB debate, again, what do you want to use it for? If you're looking for communications, I think the spot or the inReach is a neat product. If you're really looking for a life-saving device that has to work every single time without fail, a PLB is the choice. Life vests, again, carry them, cheap insurance, and think about them on some of those flights that you don't always think about survival equipment. And life rafts, if you can at all afford it, if you get a life raft, get a canopy. I just think it's the best money you'll spend. If you ever need that life raft, it'll be money well spent. I will close with a couple of survival tips. Again, there are survival experts out there who know this, but I think these are good tips just to keep in mind. Again, the overall picture is get found. This is not a Boy Scout contest to live out in the bush for 14 days. The object is to get found and get found fast. That's what it's all about. I think it's worth training with your gear. I think it's worth thinking through scenarios. Where are you going to carry your PLB? Where will you store it? Flip up the antenna if you can. Get a look at those buttons. Understand how to use it. If you have a life raft, think about how you're going to tie it down to the airplane, how you're going to inflate it. Brief your passengers. The fourth one there, I think, is a great one. The best survival tool is in your head. You've got to have a will to live. You've got to want to live. You've got to keep a positive state of mind if the worst happens. That will keep you alive more than anything. And then down at the bottom, just some things to keep in mind in terms of order of importance. Immediate medical care. Take care of any critical injuries if you crash. Then think about shelter. That shelter is very, very important. Then signaling, although hopefully you've got your PLB going already, but if you wanted to do some more signaling. And then water and food. That's a good general way to think about things if the worst happens. Take care of the critical injuries, then get some shelter. Some websites here for you to keep in mind. Again, there's that beacon registration website, beaconregistration.noaa.gov. If you buy a PLB, go there right away and register it. There's a NOAA page with more information on PLBs if you'd like it. If you want more information on the I'm OK or the PLB testing page from ACR, 406link.com has all that, including the subscriptions. If you're interested in battery service centers for that 5-year battery, there's a good website there from ACR, again, where to find a local battery provider. The last one there, totally self-interested, but all the things we've talked about tonight, they're all available at sporties.com/survival. That's your one-stop shopping for PLBs, vests, rafts, and a whole lot more. You'll want to check it out. We've got a few minutes left here, and I really appreciate your attention. I do have some questions, and I want to answer a couple of those as we go through wrapping things up here. I've got one that says, is PLB activated automatically or manually? Again, this is the one minor downside of a PLB in that you do have to survive the crash and be conscious to hit that button. So there is no way to have an automatically activated PLB. That is what an ELT would do. Along the same line, somebody else asked, what if you can't press the red button? Can search and rescue still locate you? With the PLB, no. You need to hit that button to ask for help. You want to, again, think about that and how you're going to use it, but that's where the ELT would be your backup if you were unconscious. Somebody else asked, does PLB require annual testing? Again, there's no requirement for it, but most of the units, especially the ACR units, do allow for testing anytime you want. With those battery limitations in mind, you want to probably do that on some periodic basis, and again, especially before a long trip. I have a question here from somebody who says they're a scuba diver. Do they make a waterproof at depth case for the Rescue Link? I'm not aware of one, but it's certainly something to look at from ACR. One thing to keep in mind about PLBs is they don't work great down on the under the water. So if you get it more than a foot under the water, you're probably not going to get GPS reception, and you may not do a great job on transmitting. So Again, if you're in the water, you want to get that PLB up out of the water if at all possible. Couple last questions here. Is the PLB only for aircraft? Absolutely not. One of the great things about a PLB investment, if you buy it, you can use it for your hiking, you can use it for your boating, you can use it for your canoe trip. Because it's portable, it's tied to you, the person. It's not tied to an aircraft or a vessel. So the great thing about a PLB is you can take it anywhere. It really makes it pay off. And then last question here we'll cover. Are ELTs the same in an airplane as in a helicopter? In general, yes. Really, aircraft, they don't distinguish. So the 406 ELT, you're going to need to upgrade in a helicopter just like you do in an aircraft. We're out of time tonight. I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for all the great questions. Hopefully we've answered some questions about survival gear and PLBs. Again, a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available at sporties.com/webinars next week. So if you want to review it or share it with a friend, make sure you check back and share that link. With that, thank you very much and good evening.